Hello. As you just saw, today we have a number of tricky questions. How did the modern state come to be? We know it developed over the past 500 years or so in Europe, but why? Now this might seem like a dumb question, but that's only because we take for granted that states are the dominant and universally accepted form of political organization in the world today. But why do we have states? Whatever happened to the city-state or that loose league of allied regions? And why did the modern state take form in Europe? We'll work to answer these questions by looking at the evolution of political authority in Europe. But let's begin by describing the changes that we hope to explain, starting with the beginning of the formation of the modern state towards the end of the medieval period, and going right up until today. So here's a political map of Europe, circa 1300. One thing you will probably notice is that there are tons of little political units and only a few larger entities that look something like the states we'd see on a recent map. By some counts, there were over 500 states or quasi-states at this period in Europe. Moreover, this map does not actually portray the complicated political arrangements of this era, as the entities we see here are not really unified, consolidated single states, but are part of the interrelated web of political relationships making up the feudal system. Feudalism was a system in which power was divided, and claims to sovereignty overlapped considerably. The basic idea was that serfs worked the land as ordered by local leaders, or vassals, who were given their authority by a lord who controlled a number of vassals. These vassals swore oaths of fealty to their lord, thus giving the vassal the right to rule over a territory in exchange for political and military loyalty to the lord. In turn, many lords gave their oath to the king, but they did not always, and they could and did switch sides often. Finally, in theory, the Pope sat at the top of this system as God's earthly representative. This hierarchy oversimplifies because there were often competing claims to authority, with vassals, lords, kings, and popes shifting alliances and allegiances constantly. A major part of this was overlapping legitimacy. Claims to land, birthrights, and divine legitimacy were all in conflict. This system began to erode, however, and gradually entities that look much more like the states we know and love today emerged. Here we see a political map of Europe about 350 years later, in 1648, and these are the boundaries that were codified in the Peace of Westphalia. And what you can see is a lot of much bigger political units, bigger than you actually would see on a modern political map of Europe. And basically what's been happening here is that the big fish have been eating the little ones. And the Peace of Westphalia was really a watermark moment. At this time, Europe had been torn by war for decades, with a 30 Years' War raging between Catholics and Protestants in the middle of the continent, and a war between Spain and the Dutch that had gone on for 80 years. What's important for us to note is that the signatories of the Treaty of Westphalia established the principle that secular leaders, and not religious authorities, were ultimately the sovereign power in a given territory. Of course, the sovereign state did not just appear at this moment, but it was the moment at which the idea of the sovereign state became internationally recognized by Europe's leaders as the legitimate source of political authority. Following this recognition and the advent of the age of absolutism, Europe entered a period in which empires increasingly ruled. As you can see in this map of Europe at the turn of the 20th century, in this era, Europe was ruled by a few really large empires. And indeed, these same empires ruled much of the world as the colonial powers. That all changed, however, following the seismic shifts of 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. In the wake of the First World War, the nation-state became the preferred unit of political authority. The nation-state is a political entity where national identity borders and political borders are the same. Basically, in a nation-state, all of the people in a nation are in the same state, and everybody in that state is of the same nation. This is a very idealistic notion, as there is great diversity in Europe, as there is in most of the world. Still, as the First World War was seen by many as inspired by ethno-nationalistic tensions within the old empires, many players within the international community, and particularly the United States, pushed for the creation of smaller nation-states. This trend continued following the end of the Cold War, with the dissolution of many multi-ethnic states, including the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia in the Balkans. So we now have a basic idea of what happened. The complicated jumble of claims to legitimate sovereign political authority during feudalism eventually gave way to the sole claim of the modern state. We're still left with the question of why this happened. One prominent line of research sees warfare as the cause of the modern state in Europe. These accounts often begin with the change in technology in the 14th century that slowly gave infantry an advantage over knights. So basically, new technologies like the longbow were able to penetrate knights' armor, and that meant that standing armies became the best method of warfare. There were lots of other inventions that made sea power more important, and eventually, of course, gunpowder came along. And these developments favored kings. Kings were more able than the smaller feudal vassals to raise large standing armies and to build the big fortifications necessary to defend against other standing armies. Meanwhile, a growing capitalistic merchant class wanted stability and protection to grow their businesses. Thus, they were willing to pay for the king's protection. Therefore, kings and their larger states were able to edge other political organizations out of the way, basically by outfunding and outfighting them. And therefore, the state developed bureaucracies to collect these revenues more and more effectively. As they became better at extracting, states became larger, and they became a little bit more ambitious, and hence here's the age of empires coming at you. States tried to build enormous empires, meaning that they made more and more war. Think of Napoleon's quest, and all of the monarchs of England and Spain and the Tsars of Russia, with their imperial aspirations. These frequent wars required more and more extraction. States invested heavily in their militaries, and they developed more and more deadly military technology. All of this is expensive, and they need to attract more and more revenue to fund more and more expensive wars. Charles Tilly captures the dynamics of the cycle rather simplistically, but rather profoundly, when he notes that war made states, and states made war. So that's one broad explanation. Of course, it's not the only explanation. There are other independent variables that worked alongside war making and new military technologies to explain our dependent variable here, the modern state. The increase of trade and the appearance and growth of the merchant class dwelling in towns created more wealth, and they demanded more stability, as we mentioned. There was also a cultural shift, from an emphasis upon predetermined roles in society, ranging from serf to king to pope, to a conception of society that's more rooted in the individual. The emphasis on war, military technology, and extraction of revenues does help us explain why other forms of organization, such as the city-state or the Confederation of League of Territories, did not emerge as dominant. The state was basically able to outraise and outconquer them. This process has mainly occurred in Europe over hundreds of years, but the modern state has become the dominant form of political organization all over the world. But that only happened really recently. If you look here, you can see the difference between 1900 and 2000, with the blue being sovereign states and the gray being colonies. And you can see that the blue is now, as of 10 years or 12 years ago, taken over the world pretty much. And indeed, this map understates the difference. If you think back on the fact that a lot of, or all of, the Americas were once European colonies as well, you can see that the sovereign state as a global phenomenon is something that happened over the last maybe 100 to 200 years. And this probably happened because of colonization. Basically, Europeans imposed the institution of the sovereign state upon their colonies. This is how the sovereign state became the world's darling political institution. And Europeans imposed it especially as they withdrew. When they left, they would basically say, okay, you are a sovereign state now, you are independent. Well, this brings up the interesting question as to why Europe was able to colonize and conquer so much of the world. This is an interesting open question. Of course, the technological advances, development of capitalistic societies that generated enormous wealth, that helped lead to the state, those are major reasons. But why did those happen in Europe and not some other place in the world? I'm just going to give you a little flavor of one interesting explanation, and that's from Jared Diamond in his rather famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And his explanation is that the inhabitants of Mesopotamia and Europe were simply lucky. They had a good climate, good crops, and access to animals that they could domesticate. This gave them more food, making them healthier and more able to have their leisure time devoted to technological and commercial development. And plus, living in close proximity to their domesticated animals strengthened their immune system and made them immune to many of the terrible viruses that killed off so many of the native peoples in the continents that they later colonized and enslaved. Well, perhaps the brutal efficiency of the state as Leviathan and its ability to organize, extract, and to build larger and more sophisticated war machines also played an important role in the European powers' ability to conquer so much of the planet. So, on that cheery note, I bid you adieu. Good luck with the rest of the season.